letting people work remotely is just inherently harder to monitor. So if you have very kind of control freak managers or risk averse businesses, it may be that they just want to watch over people, even if it costs them talent.
We know Toronto traffic is such a mess. Commutes that used to take 20 minutes now take 45 minutes, an hour. It's hard to predict how long it takes to get anywhere, and this is only going to make it that much worse.
So I'm sympathetic to banks and governments, and I know I'm going to get hate mail for this, but I do think people should be in office 4 to 5 days a week.
Hi, and welcome to The Missing Middle. I'm Sabrina Maddeaux.
And I'm Mike Moffatt.
And today we're talking about return to office mandates and how they may impact different generations very differently.
Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you.
So, Mike, the Ontario provincial government announced that it would be mandating the public service back to the office 4 days a week starting in the fall and 5 days a week starting in the new year. This announcement came a short while after Canada's four big banks made similar announcements. Now, I've got my own thoughts on why this is bad for younger workers, but I'd like to hear from you first. What do you think of return to office mandates?
Well, I think we can look at it three ways or ask kind of three questions of, what's good for employers, what's good for workers or employees, and what's good for society as a whole. So let's start with employers. And I think it's naturally not one size fits all. I think it really depends on the industry, the type of work, that kind of thing. Now, the kind of theory is that return to office will increase productivity. You get everybody in the same room, they're more productive. There's really not a lot of evidence either way to show it makes people more or less productive. There's some conflicting studies out there. And I suppose it's really not that surprising. Productivity is hard to measure. We've just kind of come out of the pandemic. So this is all very new. So the evidence is kind of mixed, which kind of leads to the question that if the evidence is so mixed, why are we seeing such a push to return to office? Because there's quite a few reasons to believe that remote work is actually better for the company's bottom line. The obvious one is that you just need less real estate. You need fewer offices, that kind of thing. But I think more importantly, remote work allows you to get talent from a larger geographic area. You can hire people who are unable to commute to the office for one reason or another. So, a business allowing their employees to work remotely is a bit of a moneyball strategy. It allows you to access more talent at a lower price. So, if there's cost savings to working remotely, it is a little bit unusual that we are seeing this big push to return to office. So, why is that? Well, it could just be that workplaces think that their employees will be more productive in the office, even if there isn't a lot of evidence to back that up. But I also think there's some alternate explanations. One is that I think some companies use it as a loyalty test. Let's say if the company needs to downsize for whatever reason, they can say, okay, everybody's got to return to the office, knowing that some will just be like, to heck with it, I'm out of here. And they're probably the least engaged employees, at least that's what the theory might be. So it is a way to kind of see, who's interested in continuing work there and who, may wander off. But I think at the end of the day, the biggest reason is control. I think that managers really want to have that control over people, that they want to be able to look over their shoulders. And letting people work remotely is just inherently harder to monitor. So if you have very kind of control freak managers or risk averse businesses, it may be that they just want to watch over people, even if it costs them talent. But let's get into what Premier Ford is doing. That the premier made it clear that return to office for the public sector isn't just about the performance of those workers, but it's also about getting more people downtown. It's having them take their lunches downtown and so on. So this isn't just about the performance of the organization, but it's these kind of spillover effects to the rest of the economy. So I think there's a trade-off there, though, because as you bring in more people downtown, Obviously, there's a lot more traffic, things like that. You've got your workers stuck in their cars or on the TTC or whatever for 30, 45, 60 minutes a day. That's lost time that they could be working. So that's my kind of long-winded take. I'd love to hear yours.
Yeah, obviously every workplace is different and there are a lot of different factors at play, but I am really concerned about how return to office mandates impact younger employees and also those with growing families. For one thing, we know that salaries have not kept pace with soaring rents or let alone the cost of buying. And what has happened is especially young people and young families have had to move further and further out from the downtown cores where most jobs are. Commuting also comes with extra costs, even if that's just transit, let alone driving or parking or, buying lunches. So it's expensive for people. And if they're moving away, you're looking at commutes that can be an hour, 2 hours or more, which, that's going to have an impact on productivity, on happiness, on the ability of young people to spend time with their families and partners. So, really, it's younger workers that are going to probably feel the biggest brunt of this. And you mentioned productivity. The banks are always going on and on about how unproductive the Canadian workforce is. And it's true, we do have a productivity problem. But I'm skeptical about how we can fix that when you have people trapped on streetcars or in their cars or trains hours a day commuting downtown, right? Not only is that not time they're spending working in their regular jobs, but then maybe they aren't starting that side hustle or that next business. So it's going to have larger impacts there. And then congestion. We know Toronto traffic is such a mess. Commutes that used to take 20 minutes now take 45 minutes, an hour. It's hard to predict how long it takes to get anywhere. And this is only going to make it that much worse. And there's this other interesting contradiction I keep seeing raised. On one hand, we have all these corporate ESG commitments and government climate targets. But on the other hand, they're forcing people back into cars for commutes that weren't necessary during the pandemic. So, how do you make sense of that disconnect?
I think there is a real disconnect there, and Statistics Canada has some data on commutes, and we could put that in the show notes. And we absolutely saw the length of commutes, even for people who were still going to the workplace every day, drop substantially during the pandemic because there was just less traffic. So if you were a nurse or a teacher or had a job that you have to do on site, you can't do it remote, your commute got a whole lot better. Now, as everybody's returning to the office, we're seeing those commute lengths get back up to pre-pandemic levels. In some locations, like Kitchener Waterloo, it's actually worse than before the pandemic because of extra population growth and so on. So this is a real problem. And you mentioned the ESG mandates. One of the challenges companies always have is measuring the scope of their emissions, right? So there's this whole, and we can make an entire episode about this. There's the kind of what they call like scope one, scope two, scope three emissions, which are basically like how kind of distant are your emissions from your operations, right? You can look at emissions that happen, within the company, emissions that happen in the supply chain, and so on. I think that the companies, for the most part, don't measure the emissions of their workers who have to commute back and forth. And I think if they did, as part of their ESG mandates, I don't think we'd see as many return to office work because they would absolutely realize that having people drive in every day or even take transit every day increases emissions. So this is a real problem. We always chat about these issues in our group chat. We started discussing this whole return to office mandate. And when it first came up, our producer, Meredith Martin, had some thoughts on it that she wanted to convey. And she was kind of saying, like, hey, can you say this? Can you say that? And then we just kind of realized it's like, why don't we just have Meredith say those things? So we're bringing her on right now. And so, Meredith, Sabrina and I really don't like back to the office mandates. You have a different take. Would love to hear it.
Thank you guys for allowing me to pop in like this. It is something I've thought about for a really long time, in part because I was a union branch president during the pandemic. So I helped the employer navigate everybody moving to work from home and then back to hybrid. And it was a very tumultuous time. I heard from a number of employees about that experience, both good and bad. And it made me think about the office in a way that I hadn't before. One of the things I realized is that the office is one of the few places where people get together with people that they did not choose. You might come from like a different social background, a different cultural background, a different age ranges. You might work with people much older, much younger, people from different class system. And you might not like them, but you still have to work with them and get the job done. And it's a place where you learn how to do that. And I don't know if you guys have noticed, but I feel like society's fraying a little bit. And I think it's because we've stopped being able to work together. And I have a couple of kids, and they are now in university, or one is anyway, and they're going to be eventually launching into the job market. And I feel like boomers and Gen X and millennials all had the opportunity to spend up to the first 10 years in the office where they learn from older workers how to sort of navigate work life. And I think that's really important. The other thing, Doug Ford talked about mentorship when he made the announcement. And I agree with him. I think it's virtually impossible to mentor people 100% remotely. And I think who this impacts are the youngest workers. It's true, Sabrina, what you said about families. It probably does help families with work-life balance, but you can't have just the youngest workers coming in and the oldest workers on remote, because you're not going to get the in-office, psychosocial development that you need. And the last thing I'll say is that, and I've seen this stat a few different places, but 30% or a third of people met a romantic partner at their office or through work. And we already know that people aren't hitting major life milestones. They're not coupling up. They're not having kids. And if you take away the place where up to a third of people have the potential to meet that romantic partner, I think it has huge social implications that we aren't thinking about and aren't discussed. These are intangible things that are often just left to the side. And I don't know what to do about that. Like, there are real life consequences for us choosing to not interact with one another. And so I'm sympathetic to banks and governments. And I know I'm going to get hate mail for this, but I do think people should be in office 4 to 5 days a week.
Meredith, a lot of what you said is true. There are all these intangibles, and there is a lot of value to meeting coworkers face to face, for sure. And mentorship is, I do think, harder to do virtually. I think, unfortunately, though, if you polled young people who could face up to a 2-hour commute, they'd probably still pick virtual over that in-person mentorship. And the other thing is, I also do question how much employers who are forcing this return to office 5 days are actually meaningfully investing in, that company culture and that mentorship. I mean, again, no question, both are important. But in my experience, a lot of workplaces invest a lot less in those things than years and decades past. And physical office spaces as well have just gotten significantly worse. Hotel desking where workers don't have their own space anymore, or overcrowded offices where there's not even enough desks for people unless they show up at 7 a.m. There's just really inhospitable environments for, again, having that sort of social and mentorship and professional development that you're talking about. So I think a lot of younger workers ultimately don't feel that employers are holding up their end of the bargain on this front, which isn't about them being entitled, but that's the bargain that employers themselves are putting on the table when they make the arguments for return to office.
Yeah, I would just say that it's a tricky thing to navigate, but a lot of the work mentorship that I had in my job was organic, and the culture was organic. And if leadership is bad, you're going to have a bad work environment. And so, you need to have good leaders. But I would say if there are more and more people returning to office and their experience within that office isn't good, I mean, there are things that workers can do to push back on bad environments, and that is to organize. And this is why I think this is maybe politically not the best idea for the Ford government to be mandating people. I think he is going to face backlash from just an insane amount of traffic, because although I am in favor of people working in an office, I'm not in favor of people losing 2 hours of their lives to commuting. Like, that's a terrible idea. So I think we all agree that people should have more housing options, and a lot more of those should be closer to where there are big employers.
Yeah, well, I would say though, I think it's a little bit different than when you and I were younger because, the office experience is just different than it was in 2005. Even if you have everyone in the office, we weren't on Zoom in 2005. That a lot of the work that happens in the office is still at the end of the day remote work. You're still talking into a screen. You're still talking into a camera. You're just doing it in a different building. So yeah, I do see benefits in the mentorship, but I think we overestimate the amount of mentorship that goes on. And I think we all, yes, people still form romantic relationships at work, but you could do that remotely, if you are, on screen like this. And I'm happily married, so this is, not me talking, but you see somebody, in a Zoom chat, and you get to know each other, and you find out you're both single. So I still think that these things can happen. So, overall, I fear we may end up being like romanticizing the office experience, or thinking that the office experience is like it was for young workers in, again, 2005 and 1995. And I think it's fundamentally changed. And I don't think we're going to get that toothpaste back in the tube.
You might be right, and you might be wrong. So I guess we'll find out, won't we? We'll see if there's another like hit show that comes out of this next round of Back to Office.
Could make for a good sitcom, I'm sure.
For sure it could.
Well, thank you everyone for watching and listening, and to our producer, Meredith Martin. And thank you for coming on and actually making an appearance today.
Thanks for having me.
And if you have any thoughts or questions about how to ask out your coworkers in a remote work scenario, please send us an email to missingmiddlepodcast@gmail.com.
And we'll see you next time.